Arthur Haddy, interview by Andrew Keener, 5th of December 1983, Reel 1. Mr. Haddy, who first awakened your interest in sound reproduction?
Well, in 1927, I was with the... I originally started life with CFL Limited, who built the first two links of the Imperial Wireless chain. Leaffield was the big transmitter working on pulse and arcs. And when Marconi brought the valve transmitters out, CFL went up the spout, and I got taken by the managing director into the Western Electric Company. And it was while I was there I met my present wife, and her father was a recording artist. He made the original record of Tipperary in World War One. And at one time he and Peter Dawson were the only two artists during that 1914-18 war kept under contract. Well, I went out to see this recording session. Of course, electrical recording had just started, and it was a load of junk. It wasn't Decca, it was the Crystalate company, and they were making little records for Woolworths, and they made Rex records. No, not Rex in those days, ones with a blue label. Anyhow, it's not all that important. So I went to see this session, and I jokingly said, well, I think I could make a better lot than that on the kitchen table. And it only was a joke, I assure you. But about nearly 6 months afterwards, I had a phone call through my would-be father-in-law to say that the managing director wanted to see me of Crystalate. So I went up, and I'd forgotten all about this remark. And he said, well, did you mean it? And I said, well, it was said as a joke, but I'm quite prepared to have a go. So cut a long story short, I knocked up some amplifiers, and I made a first cutting head out of a blue spot loudspeaker unit. And we took it up to the studios in Hampstead, which were the same ones, so they were Crystalate in those days. And we had an old acoustic recorder there who fiddled a cutting point onto it, and we cut discs, and sure enough, it was a damn sight better than the stuff we bought from America. Well, then they pressed me to leave the Western Electric Company. And I didn't want to, really. And but they offered me twice the salary. And so my wife said, no engagement, no bigger salary, no engagement. And that's how I went into the gramophone business. And I was with Crystalate right up until 1937, when it was bought by the Decca company. Of course, by that time, recording had made quite good progress. We had some German equipment over, which was made by the Crystalate company, and the man who made it was a chap called Eugene Bayer, who eventually was very well known because he made microphones and things in Germany. But he was also a bosom friend of George Neumann. And eventually, we had the very first actual recording machine that George Neumann ever made. And we had this equipment. It was very good when it was, but it was never stable. You get halfway through a session and everything used to cook up. And then we bought American equipment from Jenkins Adair, which was really a copy of Western Electric. And we still had that at the time when Decca bought us. That was 1937.
Could I go back a little bit to the Crystalate company? Who were the people working there at the time, and who were you recording? What kind of stuff was being made?
Sandy Powell. You're asking me. Various bands. One of the first band I ever recorded was Jay Whidden, not Jay Wilbur, Jay Whidden.
How do you spell that? Whidden.
I think he was a Canadian. at the hotel where the band were playing was eventually burnt down. He was one of the big bands of his time. I can't remember a lot of the others. I remember Sandy Powell. That chap who used to make these laughing records.
Not like the Laughing Policeman.
Yes, we made all those, the Laughing Policeman, a whole series of them. And Leslie Cerrone. Leslie Cerrone. I can't remember the name of them.
Where did you do most of the recording? Was it in Hampstead?
All in that Hampstead. We at that time we rented the West Hampstead Town Hall, and it was used on Saturdays for Jewish weddings, and so all our gear had to be packed up, and this became possible in the end, and it went on the market, and we bought it for £1,250 freehold. And my name was on the paperwork. When you think only about 8 years ago, although the site was enlarged, well, I think the old man was offered 900,000 for it. Tells you what happens to property when you buy it. No, there's still the people who are in there now are the English Opera Company. But I was there from the very beginning when it was a recording studio, when it was just the one studio at the top, the entrance, one at the entrance.
You were talking about equipment before I interrupted you. What equipment was there in the studio at the time, at the beginning, and what happened to it in the years you were there?
When I first went, well, the amplifier was made by Amplians, and who made the rest of the stuff, I've no idea. But at that time, the only professional equipment which was really perfect was the Western Electric Company equipment, which EMI were using. And at the same time, Bloomline was with the Columbia Company, and Bloomline was developing his moving coil cutter. And of course, when Louis Sterling amalgamated Columbia and HMV into EMI, Bloomline went over and took his equipment, and of course that really put HMV on the map.
This would be what date?
Oh, well, I can't tell you without going to a reference book, but it would be...
Just for record purposes.
Well, I'd have to look up a reference book, because I'd be guessing. But I should think it was... it must have been the early 30s, very early 30s, because almost immediately Bloomline got pulled off onto television work. You know, he developed the electronic camera, and although of course his patent that he put in covers everything that there is in the gramophone world. And while we're talking about it, I must tell you a little story about that. When I went to the States, I went over to the States when we developed stereo, because we had three systems. We had the carrier system, we had Hill and Dell and lateral, and we had 45-45. That was easy for us. You only had to sum and difference the amplifier. And so I could see utter chaos coming if we had Hill and Dale and someone else had 45-45. So I said to the old man, I'm going over to the States and see if I can't pull boys together. And I went over, I took a chap called Goodman with me, Bob Goodman, all our equipment. This was reproducing equipment. And we got into New York on Saturday night. Sunday morning we went down to the London record buildings to unpack all our equipment. And Bob and I promptly got arrested in New York for working on a Sunday morning in New York without a permit, which cost the company about $50 each.
Oh, no.
Well, we gave the demonstration that afternoon of stereo to RCA, and then the old man packed us on for plane that night. It was a bloody charter plane with your food in a cardboard box, the only way we could get up there, up to Los Angeles. And I had an appointment with Dr. Frayne. Now, Dr. Frayne is a real big noiser, he was then. And I must say I was met by all the boys from the big record companies. There was Ed Royce from RCA and Ben Bauer from CBS, and Decca chap who was killed in an air crash. But they were marvellous. They couldn't believe that we brought all the equipment, you see, so we arrived up at...
Must have cost you a fortune in
yes.
excess.
Well, we arrived up at the Bell Telephone Labs, and old Dr. Frayne, because it was all our equipment was 220, and we wanted an auto transformer. Oh, we should know such thing in this place.
Oh,
that's absolutely true. Yes. So, at any rate, the boys took him out to lunch and treated him very well.
And he found one.
When he came back in the afternoon, he went to sleep, and someone produced an auto transformer, and we put all our equipment up. And we gave a demonstration of Hillendale and Lateral. Matter of fact, it's basically that record that we put out later as the Journey into Stereo Sound. And eventually they produced a 16-inch record recorded at 33 1/3, which the Western Electric Company had recorded. That it was made with their moving coil equipment. And of course, I know now what we heard was the original recording of My Fair Lady, and it was bloody good, you know. So they went and fetched old Dr. Frayne. Well, he'd never heard the record played well because we had a little high fidelity pickup, and he became quite amiable. And then we managed to tell him that we didn't want to sell the equipment, or anything. All we wanted to do was to get the industry all off on the same foot. And then he turned around and said, well, that's impossible because, you see, we've got patents on all this. I then laid Bloomline's patent on the table. and there was dead silence for about 5 minutes. They didn't even know it existed. That's absolutely true. And we ended up with an agreement that we wouldn't do anything for 3 months, and they wouldn't do anything for 3 months to allow them to evaluate the systems. Well, they didn't keep to their word. About 3 weeks afterwards, they were down in New York at the radio fair demonstrating this. So the old man then said, well, you know, we pull no punches, and we went. But that was the start of all the companies getting together and standardizing, although they claim in all the literature that the American companies standardized. We didn't mind whether they went Hillendale and Lateral or but all 45 did. It gave you a little longer playing time. You could get about another 2 minutes on a record. But there were various meetings all over Europe and other places, and it was standardized. I've got records of all those meetings here, if you'd like to see them. Well, now you know how I got into electrical recording. I think that the advent of electrical recording was the biggest thing there's ever been in the gramophone business. I mean, and this is where we started to. 1937, we were building our own moving coil recording head, and we were desperate to extend the frequency range. I mean, we'd heard small samples of FM, and then the war came along, and everything shut down except records for music while you work and that sort of thing. And we were approached by the Air Ministry to produce records with a frequency response up to 14,000. This is a story you've probably all heard or read. At any rate, we realised that from this, you know, as soon as the war was over, we really got the goods. And we started with FFRR.
Whose baby was the trademark?
That was Atwood, a chap called Atwood. He was quite crazy, but he was marvellous. He did the advertising for Radar and Navigator, and he produced the FFRR and the Ear. And that really gave us, at that time we were producing 12-inch classicals. We just started off with that marvellous orchestra, made up of all the orchestras. It was a wartime job.
That wasn't the National?
Yeah, National Symphony Orchestra. It was Sidney Beer. Sidney Beer. And we made some very, very good recordings. And in fact, we were shipping these over on the Queen Mary. 16 ton a time on the Queen Mary. We couldn't get them out to the States quick enough.
Shellac. God,
shellac, yes, shellac, yes. We were doing quite well on that until Peter Goldmark in the States, of course, dropped the bombshell about LP. Well, we'd had a little bit of experience this because when we were with Crystalate, we bought out the... What the hell was the name of that company?
Who made the early LPs, you mean?
No, they made Fortune records with two tunes on each side.
Fortune, I like it.
Yeah, Fortune records at 78. They were never any damn good because the needle used to wear out before it got to
How
the
long
end.
playing time they used to be?
Oh, you used to do about 6 minutes.
6 minutes. I see.
Yeah.
I'm going to mix up with something else. Yeah.
Vocalion.
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 Yeah.
So we had a little bit of experience, but of course CBS had the jump on everybody because they'd recorded all their major works on 16-inch discs. So they only had to take the mother and dub off the mother, and they could they really got a replacement for tape.
What kind of needlewood track there was at that stage, at that date? Was there one that could cope with
Oh yes, yes. I think. Well, they were vinylite, and I don't know what their reproducer was, but I would think it was a Sapphire. Anyway, that's how they produced their first, how Peter Goldmark, you know. And the old man, I don't mind putting it down. The old man that called me up there, up to head office, and he said, I'm going over to the States, Haddy, he said, but this will all die in about 3 months, you know. He said, I've been in this business too long. But he'd only been out in the States about 3 weeks, and he was cabling for merchandise. God, this is when John Colshall came into the picture, because all we had was 78 mothers, and we had 4 turntables, and 4 engineers sitting all queued up with John Colshall at the back. Yeah, that's right. And that's how our very early LPs were produced, which was, they were a travesty, actually, from the musical point of view. But it gave us a big start.
The problem at the beginning of FFR was the technical problem was surface noise, wasn't it? How did you get over that at the very beginning of FFR?
Well, on
the cutting.
No, it wasn't due to the cutting. It was the factory work that produced that. Because by this time we were cutting on acetate discs.
That's right.
And an acetate disc was dead quiet. But by the time they'd mutilated it down at Malden and polished it with Brasso and et cetera, the big improvement that we'd skipped over in the factory was in the early days, they used to graphite the wax, and they used to brush this graphite on with a camel hair brush. And it not only, all they wanted to see was a shine on it, it didn't care how much of the waveform they filled up with graphite. Well, in just the time when Decca took over, EMI had developed a system of sputtering with gold. This is the initial depositing it electronically. And we'd taken another patent with another German firm to deposit silver. And of course, this was the big step forward, really, from the factory, because when you played the mother, as you would an ordinary record, it was dead quiet.
Yeah. You've got some dates there for
yes,
stereo demonstration.
The first European meeting between major recording companies to discuss the standards of a stereo disc recording was held at Music Vertrieb in Zurich on the 28th of November 57. I called this meeting, and we had Deutsche Grammophon, all the big gramophone companies in Europe attended, and attached to it, here we are, from Teldec, Mr. Ridlick and Mr. Klemp, from EMI, Mr. Ham Clark and Dr. Dutton, from Deutsche Grammophon, Dr. Steinhausen, from Telefunken, Dr. Schleswig, from Electrola, Mr. Berkovich, and from Philips, Mr. Seisen. And from Decca, there was Haddy, Goodman, and Windybank. And that was the actual agenda. That was the agenda for the meeting. And at the end of this meeting, we agreed that we would go 45-45. And that was when I went over to the States to push the results of this meeting onto the American companies. And I can say quite truthfully, the outcome of this was that we never had there was no cock-up at all in producing a standard record for all countries all over the world. If they'd only have done this with stereo, what do you call it, four-dimensional sound, quadraphonic, it might have found a place in, but everybody was using different equipment, and you couldn't play one record on another, and these things are bound to fail. And it's interesting at this point, because I think we ought to get on to tape a little bit.
I want to move on to that, but since you mentioned quadraphonic, do you think there would have been any future aesthetic in it?
No.
I mean, apart from the fact that the systems were...
Personally, I discussed this with a lot of big conductors, and a man who gave us an awful lot of help was Ernest Onsme of the Swiss Roman. And he was not only a good conductor, but he was a brilliant mathematician. And he just wouldn't listen to it. He didn't particularly like stereo to start with, because he was used to standing in the centre of the orchestra, and these are the first violins, and there's the violas, and there's the cellos, and there's the basses, and he would look up. But he gave us a tremendous amount of help in I think we made some of the best early stereo records we made with Onsme.
The best first LPs as well.
Yes.
The best FFR. The first FFR was Firebird or Petrushka.
Petrushka, I think.
Yes.
Because Onsme excelled in all that modern music, Stravinsky, Bluebeard's Castle, and all that.
But he wasn't sold on quadraphonic.
No, it couldn't interest him in quadraphonic. And I always felt I couldn't get any enthusiasm myself, I'm being absolutely honest, because it didn't seem natural to me. But when you heard stereo balanced well, of course, by this time people were doing a lot of faking, but if it was balanced well with a minimum of a number of microphones, so you didn't get phase cancellation and this sort of thing, you could get some amazingly good results, especially if you reproduced it at the right level. Everything we did for Onsme, we used to play back in a good beefy 20 watts. And then he'd say, he used to knit his teeth, and he'd say, I want to hear it at home level. and then we had to play it very softly. And of course the actual curve of the ear changes completely, as you know. As you bring up the volume, the low end and the top end come up to flatten it out. And
you miss things.
Yes. Oh, yes, yes. I don't know where we lost ourselves a little bit.
No, I wanted to. You wanted to come onto tape, and this is a way of coming onto tape because you were talking about faking, and I think you right through Decca mixed right down onto 2-track, didn't they? Right through stereo, directly down.
We recorded all our classical music direct onto 2-track.
What kind of microphone setup would you have used, say, in 1958 for recording something pure orchestral? Like Berlioz is fantastic.
Well, 58 we were using Neumann. Neumann developed some very good microphones with what we call a slack diaphragm, rather like Voigt's job. The diaphragm wasn't under tension, and these were marvelous for us. But of course, he wanted to supply the television companies, and once they got them under the lights, with the heat of the lights, they used to collapse completely. But we had some Neumann 56s. They've still got some, and they still use them, which is a slack diaphragm mic. If you measure these against the stretch diaphragm, which is taunt, the measurements come out the same. But I assure you, the sound is not the same. It's quite different.
In what way? Broadly speaking, it's smoother,
it's more resonant. It's you seem to. Neumann himself could never explain it, but it's you could pick up a record and say, oh yes, they were working so. They used a 53 or another mic which has got a hard diaphragm, and everybody uses it now. You see. There were one or two little condenser mics about, which were made by old Captain Round. I don't know if that rings a bell with you. Captain Round was originally with the Marconi Company, and he was the chap, he and his brother, they at 2LO, and they used to give these first concerts from Rittel, and he developed this little condenser microphone. But there again, they were all very unstable, but they gave you very, very good results.
What kind? We've ascertained the type of mic.
Yeah.
The types of diaphragm you might have used around then. How many in a studio session of, say, 100 orchestra?
Well, it depended entirely.
What kind of, in Kingsway, for instance?
Well, in Kingsway, well, we used to work with 3 in the centre, which gave you the centre, the right, and the left as the first violins. The centre, which would be some of the violas and some of the cellos, and the stuff on the other side, the cellos and the basses. And possibly for solos, we had another mic out over the woodwind, because if you had a woodwind solo, it sounded too distant. And talking about microphones, it's worth at this stage talking a little bit about balancing and balance engineers. And in Decca, we were always very keen to have a balance engineer who was an engineer and not a frustrated musician. We found that if an engineer had a very good musical background and it was an interesting session, his concentration drifted away from his mod meters and his mixing desk to the performance, and this is absolutely deadly. The Germans originally always used a frustrated conductor as a tonmeister, and that's why some of the early German classical recordings were not as good as they should have been. And we always had with us a musical director who's in the studio, whose word was absolutely law about tempo, performance, and so on and so forth. But anything to do with the dynamic range, the engineer had a say. In other words, if it was three pianos and they played four and it was down in the dirt, we'd stop and we'd want to reshoot.
Cassette side 2.
I attended one session, a big opera session, and I don't know, it was RCA were doing it in the Opera House in Rome, and there were some bells in this recording, and the musical director stood by and he was saying, more, 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 and the mob meters were all hard over. And that's the sort of thing that unless you have very good feeling between the engineering staff and the musical staff, and they really cooperate, this is why I think a lot of recordings got spoiled.
So what you're saying really is that the producer and the musical supervisor and the engineer are separate roles, and should continue to be.
Not in separate rooms, they
separate roles.
Roles, oh yes, absolutely separate roles. Different staff, different payroll. And it worked very well. I mean, John Coleshaw produced some marvellous operas and things, but without having the right engineers with him, you know, these things could have been catastrophic with off-stage noises you couldn't hear and all that sort of thing. And I think we still do that in Decca today. We've got some of the younger balance engineers now who are exceedingly good. They have good musical knowledge, but when they're on a session, they can blot out everything out of their mind except what they're listening to. They're listening to a brass section. They want to hear the three trumpets, not the first trumpet up here and the other two faint and distant in the background. That's one of the things that you can either do or you can't do.
It's a tremendous discipline to stop one part of your mind taking over.
Well, you can do it, but you can't do it if your main love is music. We had one chap with Gordon Parry who he knew the whole of the score of The Ring, page by page. He absolutely staggered the Germans. The Germans didn't believe that it was possible for an Englishman to know the whole of The Ring off by heart. But Parry used to get so excited on a session about the performance. But the gear, it didn't matter, because the end product in the record business is what you bring out on the disc. We had terrible trouble with this German conductor. He took over the Vienna Opera House in the end. Perhaps I better not mention that.
I think I know who you mean.
But anyhow, he insisted on such a range of dynamics that when we produced the final record, if the wind was blowing outside and there were a few leaves going past the house, you couldn't hear anything. I remember the Nile scene in Aida. You know, it was very artistic, but absolutely useless from the recording point of view.
You wanted to say something about tape. Using tape.
Well, we started using tape. I remember the first session in Kingsway Hall where we cut both disc and tape together. And in these days, we had an EMI machine. Probably it was a BTR1. And for what it was for its time, it was very good. I took it to Switzerland for a lot of recordings and demonstrated it to the PTT, who control everything in the broadcasting stations. And they were quite thrilled with it because they had French equipment made by Motorsouskouche. And I came back and passed all this information on to Emmy. They didn't do a damn thing about it. They could have sold the whole stock of machines. But we lived with Emmy. We lived with BTR 1s and BTR 2s, BTR 3s. And always we shot direct, as you know, on 2-track. And when we cut the disc, we always used the master. We made a copy, which we put in the libraries for safety copy. But all our major recordings were cut from the master tape. And I think that gave us the edge, definitely on other people, from tape modulation noise and this sort of thing.
What speed were you recording at in those days? 15 or 30?
Well, we started originally, before, this is just when LP was breaking, we started at, we had 30, but you see you couldn't get...
Expensive business.
Well, we weren't worried about that, but it was time. you couldn't get a 22-minute tape.
On a reel.
No.
Yeah.
So we, you know, with lots of tears, we went to 15. But of course, with the tape, with modern tape and modern improvements, and it's actually fantastic what you can even get at 3.5 or the little cassette.
When did you start making the first stereo recordings? Can you remember the first stereo recording that you worked on?
Well, what we did, you see, we used to send 2 kits of equipment, because it was all classical stuff we were doing. We had 2 complete sets of equipment, 2 lorries, 2 lorry loads, mono and stereo. But in the very early days, the stereo boys had to step back for the mono boys, because that was the product that was bringing in the money.
You had 2 control rooms?
2 control rooms, yes. Two crews and 2 musical directors.
Oh, that's chaotic.
Well, it wasn't really. We had more trouble with artists, especially people like Mario Delmonica. We made a lot of recordings in Rome, and they couldn't understand when they heard the stereo playback, you know, where you know, he was standing right in front of the bike centre stage, but his voice was over there. Oh, we had awful trouble. But it was gradually accepted in the end.
Who would make the decisions, though? Who would make the decisions as to what needed retaking? The mono boy?
No, in the very beginning, yes, the musical director who was in charge of mono, because at the end of the month the records had to be produced and those records had to go out. Whereas when we had the stereo tapes, the boys used to come back to the studio and play hell with them afterwards, you know.
Can we move on a couple of years? There are a couple of things gaps I want to fill in before we go back. I'm sure you do too.
Yeah.
But we're coming on to the late 50s and then early 60s. When did Dolby first hit Decca?
Well, now this is a very interesting story. Ray Dolby, everybody at this time was interested in noise suppression. We had studio equipment of various, EMI produced some stuff, and one day Ray Dolby turned up in the studios, and he said, we've just done a job with the post office where we've sent signals right up to Land's End through all the repeater stations and all the way back, and they've given us 100% clearance. So I became very interested in this, and we persuaded Ray Dolby to loan us a set of equipment, and it was the Decca boys in Hampstead who put Ray Dolby on the map, and Ray will tell you that. When they gave me my Emil Berliner Award in New York, Ray Dolby came up to me and he said, Arthur, if it hadn't been for that lucky afternoon, he said, I don't think I should be over here in the States now. It was just the break he needed. And of course, as soon as we started using Dolby, then everybody else who used our catalogue had to have Dolby because it was
Your
on
tapes were encoded.
Yes,
Yeah.
they're all on tape, you see. And it wasn't very long before we were with RCA at that time, RCA, CBS, they all, within about 3 years, Dolby was established.
Do you think what are the disadvantages in your view of the system, if any?
Well, if everything is set right on the Dolby, and it must be absolutely right, the disadvantages are minimal. But it needs constant checking all the time in case these things drift. And of course, he's made vast improvements as the years have gone by, as you know. There are still people who don't like Dolby. Very young people with fantastic ears, possibly they can hear it, I don't know. But commercially, it was one of the big things for the record business. And certainly...
And for the cinema business.
Yes, and certainly for tape, you see. We're almost now coming on to digital.
That's right, so we'll take a break then.
Yes, all right.
Still with Dolby for a moment, there are some people who believe that the top goes rather, or there are other side effects like pumping, for instance.
Well, pumping is definitely something wrong in the adjustment,
Yes.
and the fact that that you seem to lose top if you stand in the hall in front of the orchestra. You don't get the hard brilliance that you get often in a recording with. Dolby seems to smooth it off to really match what you hear in the hall, and the only way you can, you see, we had tremendous advantage. We could be doing a session, and then they were going to rehearse for 10 minutes, so one could go out and sit behind the conductor and listen. And it's when you can do this, you realise how damn bad all recordings is actually. I have heard people make that statement, but I think I had a very good pair of ears, and it as long as the Dolby was set up properly, and then there were no problems.
Very, very often, the kind of people you just mentioned are the kind of people who turn up at a concert once in a while and want to turn the volume up.
Yes.
That's the kind of thing.
Yes.
It sounds dull to them.
It's fantastic to I mean, we could always walk out of the booth into the studio, and it's only by doing this. I mean, you look through the window, the control window, and you see a brass section playing. You see three trumpets playing. It isn't until you've been on the job quite a time you think, oh God, that first trumpet's too close, and he's got such intensity, and you're controlling it on the mod meter, and you controlling, and you shut him down, and you lose your second and third trumpet. And this is one of the arts in balancing an orchestra.
But you move the microphone rather than put another track out.
What we did in some cases, we put a fake mic out and say, look, Mr. Longinetti, you're such a marvellous trumpet. We want this almost a solo from you, and then open up the other one.
I see you have there some patents. There's one there. When does that date from for groove modulation?
This one was filed in 20th of April 65. This was the one for stereo. Oh no, it isn't. I'm sorry, that's a special pickup, that one.
The one you were showing me.
Yeah, that's an earlier one.
Yes.
Yes, this is the one. This is the first one. We had this on all our actual cutting machines, you see. But as the pattern was issued,
My introduction, this is about 1955. I would just so we know what day we're talking about.
This was the completed. It was filed in August the 10th, 54, and it was the final specification came out in 1955. That's when it was published for anybody to buy it. And at this time, EMI, of course, hadn't got this, so they, in their cutting rooms around in Abbey Road, they used to have a musical bod sitting with a cutting engineer with a score and a potentiometer that controlled the thread. And as he saw, there was a big fortissimo coming up, he'd open the grooves up a little bit. But ours was all automatic.
Thanks to this patent.
Yes, that was patented.
So really what you're saying, if you, for instance, in the finale of Saint-Saëns' organ symphony, just before that great organ crash comes after the silence, that would now be electronically monitored.
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, all it did, it opened up the grooves to allow the enough space between to take the modulation, you see.
And to take pre-echo, the danger of pre-echo out. Would that be the same thing?
Pre-echo, very little pre-echo comes from the actual recording. We know you get pre-echo on tape, but I mean you can take care of that today with modern tape. And pre-echo in cutting, you can cut a disc, and you play it with a very good pickup, and there's not a trace of pre-echo. You send it to the factory, and you get pressings back, horrible pre-echo. Now this was some of Mr. Townsley's bloody famous chemistry. What actually happens is, if you record onto copper, and you were to make as they did in the early days, a copper stamper, there would be no pre-echo. But the stamper would be so soft that after 500 or 600 pressings it was finished. So they started making the stampers of nickel. Now, when you put nickel onto copper, the nickel being a stronger, chemically a stronger metal, compresses the copper, and it's the plating of the nickel that puts the bloody pre-echo on there. I mean, we proved all this in the end. But if you do it very slowly, if you put, you see, they were trying to rush things through the bath in 4 or 6 hours, whereas they should have had 30 hours. So you plate onto the copper very slowly until the nickel is built up. It's the speed of the deposit of the nickel that does the damage. And then when you had about perhaps 5 or 6 hours or more of nickel, then you could turn the whack up on the bath. And but these were, you shouldn't get records today with pre-echo. This should be a thing of the past. Very little ever came from the. In fact, we used to have a test disc that we used to cut regularly for the factory, because if we found that records were coming through with pre-echo, we would cut this disc again off a tape, and we'd send some of these blanks to the factory, and if they put them in the nickel bath and there was pre-echo on, they knew that the bath needed rebalancing, and that was the simple way that we controlled the baths in the factory. A good balance engineer, a good cutting engineer, can pick up a disc, and with a light across the disc, he can see from the waveform, those cellos are too loud, and that timpani is too loud, because they all have fundamental shapes. A string bass has got quite a sweeping waveform. A percussion instrument is almost a square. It goes up and then along and then down. And it's a chap who's been cutting. Well, in fact, in the early days, you see, you could only read your disc because you couldn't play it to see it was a master. You couldn't play it to see it was any good.
Well,
so you had to learn. You had to learn to pick it up and read it and say, well, that's okay. or perhaps we'll do it again because I think we can take a little bit more bottom along, at that passage. And I think it's absolutely essential. And all the cutting engineers in Decca, even today, Goodall, all of them, all the top boys, they've all done their stint in the cutting rooms before they went out into studio work.
When did you first meet Bloomline?
I only met Bloomline once at a patent conference, and I was such a little boy, and I was so frightened. Except that I knew where he worked. He was in that time. He was then with the MI, but he was a great friend of Dr. Dutton's, and Bloomline was in Standard Telephones and Cables in the at Connaught House at the time when I was also in Standard Telephones in a very much minor job. But everything that Bloomline touched, didn't matter what he touched, and he was a great humorist, so I'm told. Dutton, who knew him very well, reckoned that with a paper clip and an elastic band he could ping a bloke's ear at 25 feet. I couldn't believe it the day when we heard he was killed. I mean, it was a national loss. He had a chap called Brown with him, who was the man on lenses. Obviously, the Bloomlines told you that the radar gun sight was all Bloomline's work. I'm not going to talk about that because they must have told you all about that. When people were going around saying our pilots are bloody good because they eat carrots. But it was this little cathode ray tube, that when they came up behind a night fighter and the little line spread out, and when it touched the edges, that was it.
Yeah.
He was a fantastic chap.
Well, the old man we've been referring to, Sir Edward Lewis. When did you first either cross swords, or if you did, or come into contact with him in a professional way?
I never. When he bought the Crystalate company in 1937, there were two studios. There was the Crystalate studio at Hampstead, and there was the Decca studio down in Thames Street in an old in a wharf down there. And we quite expected, we Decca boys, at the end of every month, well, that's your final paycheck. And this went on and on and on for nearly a year. And I shall never forget it. We had an artist called Joe Peterson, who was a girl, but he used to go on the music halls and sing as a boy. Had a marvellous voice. And one Friday afternoon, we had 4 numbers to do, and one was the old rustic bridge by the mill, sung by Joe Peterson. And I said to Wilkinson, who was my number 2 in those days, I said, Ken, this must be the bloody end. Do you know, we lived on that record for about 9 months. It somehow or other it clicked. It sold. And then we heard that Sir Edward, or he was then Mr. Lewis, he decided to close the Decca studios in Upper Thames Street and keep our studios running. And I don't want to stick my neck out, but I heard afterwards that Darrell Morford Davis, who was the chairman of Crystalate, he told, he said, well, Ted, you've got a good bargain, in buying the Crystalate company, but he said the best buy that you've made is young Haddy from Hampstead. And that came back to me. The old man told me that himself. But we were so enthusiastic in those days. We used to work at 4 o'clock in the morning, and just purely for the love of it. In fact, when I was designing my moving car, my first wide-range cutter, I used to work over at Haynes Radio because they had a very good lab there. And at the old Freddie Haynes, he was a brilliant man. He only used to work at night, but I had to work during the day. And at the end of 6 months, I just collapsed. I couldn't do any more. And then my wife was having a baby and all. And I lived in Cheshunt in the wilds. And Maurice Marder used to break down on the Cambridge Road at 4 o'clock in the morning.
Was he an easy man to get on with?
I never had a crossword with him. I never had a crossword with him. He once he made his decision, he never retracted on his word, and he did marvelous things for many artists. But you couldn't bluff him. If you didn't know, you had to say you didn't know, and then you could get on all right.
I've read that the only person who did flummox him, I think I've got the story right, once was George Sell.
Ah, but George Sell was George Sell was the conductor, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's quite likely because the old man was not at home with artists. He didn't like them. He didn't trust them. He had good reason to, but he did some marvelous things. He.
Did she not have much as much liaison with artists as certain other people in his position?
Oh no, he didn't. He hadn't. He would only finally agree their contract or not agree their contract. The man who really built the Decca classical catalogue was Maurice Rosengarten from Zurich, and he was a marvelous little man. He found George Solti. And after the war, you see, he had Swiss francs, and that was the only free currency. And so he could get what artists he wanted, Swiss francs. He got all the big German people like Knappersbusch, all the big artists, they all flocked with Swiss francs, Swiss francs. And this is a true story. The old man realised after a while that he didn't own the Decca classical catalogue. Rosengarten owned it. And the story goes that they met in the Savoy Hotel on a Saturday evening after the Jewish Sabbath had ended, and they talked through the night until 4 o'clock in the morning. And Rosengarten said, "Well, Ted," he said, "I'll sell it back to you for exactly what I've paid for it." And the deal was done. And those two men, after that, were inseparable. If they sat at the table together, God help anybody who was sitting the other side, because their brains worked quite differently. But Rosengarten was fantastic. If anything happened at a concert tonight in the Metropolitan in New York, he'd know by 4 o'clock in the morning. He had everybody on his payroll. All the big, what do they call these people who engage artists? There's a special name for them. Well, all these people were on his payroll. Legitimately, you know, he wanted, and he used to sign it. I mean, he signed up to Dolby when she was 17. I made her first record when she was 17. She made 4 songs on a Sunday morning in Geneva.
Was that with Anthony, or was it piano?
No. It was with this Italian conductor with a big tune. Can't remember his name.
Haddy.
Yes. Shut that off a second.
What was Rosengarten's role in the company at this time?
Well, I'll tell you. During the war, Rosengarten had a small factory in Switzerland, and he imported Brunswick records of Bing Crosby and these people, and he copied them, and he issued them on the Swiss market, and he kept the Decca name alive. After the war, I went over with Harry Sarton, who was our artist manager, on reconnaissance tour of Europe looking for recording material. And then we went to see Rosengarten. And then that's how Rosengarten started to. He loved this business of artists, and he had a great flair for select. He could put an opera together with a cast that didn't fight amongst itself. You know, the soprano wouldn't walk out halfway through, and it was a terrible problem. And he was very good at it. And eventually,
what was Rosengarten's position with the company at this time? Was it closer to artists than
well,
Lewis was?
well, I don't know about this time, but after the war, due to the situation of the Swiss franc, Rosengarten was in a position to contract any artist, European artist, German or anyone that he wanted, because they all wanted currency, either dollars or Swiss francs. Swiss francs were even better than dollars. And slowly Rosengarten, Ansame, all the artists we had, all the big German artists, what's chap I told you a minute ago? Come on, my memory's going now. No, yes, Reedy was one, but the big German conductor.
Knappersbusch?
Yes, Knappersbusch. And then he brought the big pianist, Backhouse. Marvellous man. I can tell you some good stories about Backhouse. And after about a couple of years, Rosengarten actually owned the classical catalogue, and he wasn't tied to Decca at all. And he had a long meeting with Sir Edward, and the outcome of this meeting was that he sold all the catalogue back to Sir Edward for the exact money that he'd spent out. And then he became a full director of Decca Limited with a big block of shares which he bought, and he took over the running completely of the Decca classical operation, everything. And if he hadn't have died, we should never have gone up the spout.
I think I have a book there which mentions the hair that you patented. This is H.E. Roy's book.
Yes,
Disc Recording
Reproduction, edited by H.E. Roy's. He was the chief engineer for RCA.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me what the events surrounding your development?
Yes, you see, I will tell you. In about 1932, or no, perhaps a little more, 32, 33, I heard a recording that Voight had made. And it was made with one microphone in a cinema in Hammersmith of someone playing Silver Threads Amongst the Gold. And I really thought it was the most fantastic recording I'd ever heard. And I got to know Voight quite well, and I bought his patent. And he was very keen on moving coil loudspeakers. He had the first real efficient moving coil loudspeaker, and his cutter, which he belonged to Edison Bell, but he was many years ahead of his time. Actually, he developed a little pickup, a moving coil pickup, but he didn't believe that it was possible to get more than 5,000 or 6,000 off a disc. You know, he told me quite bluntly to my face, "Arthur, you're wasting your time." And in the next room, you know, we had records in there going up to 14,000 at this time. But the great thing with the moving coil cutter is there is no distortion from the cutting head. All the early cutting heads were iron, and they had what we call iron distortion, where the armature didn't move in constant flux. And it's like the difference between a blue spot loudspeaker, which was moving iron, and a good moving coil loudspeaker. I mean, moving loudspeakers didn't arrive until the moving coil loudspeaker arrived. Well, that's the same with cutting heads. And I became very interested in this. We built an enormous number of them. Unfortunately, we didn't keep them from a museum because they started quite small and they grew and they grew and they grew, because what we had to get was a terrific flux across the head. And Voigt's head was rather like bloom lines in a way that it was very heavy, and to counterbalance it, and to cut wax was a very difficult operation. And I could see no reason why you shouldn't.
Why was it difficult to counterbalance?
Well, you've only got a soft wax, and if the wax is moving a little bit, the cut
the inertia. You mean?
Oh yes, it was a nightmare. In fact, they used to use what they called an advance ball, which was a round sapphire ball in front, but that used to mark the wax. And I suddenly said, I can't see why if we make the coil twist instead of go this way, why we shouldn't support the magnet and let the coil float free in the gap, which is what's shown here. You see, there's the counterbalance weights taking the enormous weight. You see, there's the cutting table.
This is on page 66 of the book.
Yes. And I'll tell you what, if anybody ever wants to go and see one, there's one of these in the Science Museum. It's in the Science Museum for anybody to see.
Yes, of course, I will.
That was really put FFRR on the map as well, because when the war was over, everybody knew that television was coming in for a certainty. As you know, we had it here before the war, though the Americans didn't believe it. And the big companies, RCA, so they were thinking of getting out of the record business. And it was only when we came back with FFRR, and that's why I got the nickname in the States as the father of hi-fi, which I never had any cross words with the Americans. I found them very easy to work with, and actually a little bit leaning towards their own country all the time, but the top people, Ben Bauer and all these names that you read about, they were marvellous people, really.
One thing we had an example was the popular catalogue, which when was in existence far longer before Decca started making classical recordings, wasn't it?
Oh, Bert Ambrose.
Yes. Which artists were you working with when you first went into Decca on that side?
Well, I used to do just sessions with other chaps. You didn't have, you had a musical director in those days, and he more or less took charge of the sessions. And even in those days, we had a classical director you may have known. Did you know Yeomans? Walter Yeomans. Oh, he was a great chap. He really knew his job as a musician. But, he'd doze off and we'd turn the score upside down and he'd still turn pages. But everything I really know about an orchestra, I learnt from the musical directors. Victor Olaf was a fantastic chap.
What was his background?
Well, he was with the BBC originally, and then he had a small quartet, and then during the war he was down at your place near Worcester. Evesham, was it?
Sorry.
He was down at Evesham, and then he became manager to Sir Thomas Beecham, and that's where he really put on his best coat.
That was with Emmy, of course. That was with Emmy.
No,
but
not
he was producing Beecham records.
No, not
eventually.
Eventually, when he left Decca, but he didn't. we brought him in because we had, as a musical director, we had Boyd Neal, and all the engineers called him Boiled Veal. But he's a lovable character, Boyd Neal. But he used to turn up. You'd have a day's recording. He'd turn up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, halfway through the session, say, "Everything all right, chaps," and walk out. You know, you haven't got a clue. And I said to the old man, I said, "This is useless. You know, it's no good the engineer staff trying to do. We must have a really first-class musical director." And we brought Victor Olaf in, and he was very good. You know, I can remember in Vienna with the Vienna Philharmonic. And if you walk round to the last desk of the violins, you had to address the little man who sat there as Herr Professor, otherwise he wouldn't take his eyes off. And Olaf would go up and tap him on the shoulder and say, "Look, keep the bow nearer the bridge. Let's hear the bloody thing." Because he knew voice production, and we all learned a tremendous amount from Victor. Marvellous man.
Of course, the art of balancing in many ways is a very subjective thing, isn't it? One's mind can alter from one day's beginning to its end about exactly whether this balance works or not.
Yes, absolutely.
Do you find that you might set up a balance which sounds marvellous in the morning, come to it after lunch and think, "God, that's awful"?
Yes. The different environment that you've been out to during the lunch period. There's another thing which is very interesting. If you do a recording session and you have a conductor who will talk, if the session goes through to the tea break in an hour and a half and it seems like 10 minutes, you've got a damn good recording in the can. But if it's one of these sessions that drags on and on, because every 2 or 3 minutes the conductor stops and he goes back and he wants to go through it again, the orchestra get weary, the engineers get weary, and the result is disastrous. That's my opinion, and that does happen, I assure you. And you can't change that.
And the depression gets set in then, because Cultural said there's nothing more depressing than knowing you're making a bad record.
That's right.
Having to go on making it.
That's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. In fact, in many cases, it's better, you know, to cancel that session and start it again.
Tell me about when tape came. Decca started using tape as a home product.
Well, every year we used to have a meeting in Paris, an international meeting, which was chaired by Rosengarten, and Threadwood was always there, and all people from America, London Records, people from Teldec. And I was called back after one of these meetings by the chairman, and he said, "Haddy, Rosengarten tells me that Teldec have sold 1 million tapes last year. Get in the business." That was my briefing. Well, to cut a long story short, the Germans were very good. They opened the factory to us, and I sent some of my engineers over there for, I think, 3 months training. Then I sent them to America, to the Gauss electronics people. And then I had a hell of a row with Townsley because he wanted this to go in the record factory, and I said, "Over my dead body." You know, this is an electronics job, it's nothing for steam and muck. And so we put it up at Bridgenorth in the radio factory. Oh, that was very good, but we were always second-class citizens in the radio factory. You know, if someone wanted maintenance work done, the radio people, you know, 4,000 televisions a week, you can wait. So I persuaded the old man there was some new factories going up at Telford. This is where the Industrial Revolution started. It's a very interesting town, Telford. And he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I've got no faith in tape." And anyway, to cut a long story short, Arthur Cullis, who was another of my co-directors, he backed me. Eventually we got the old man to agree, and before he could change his mind, we'd signed a contract for 7 years for this factory. Well, of course, we'd only just moved in there, and he wanted to cancel the whole thing. He couldn't, it was too late. We never looked back from that day. We find the labour force up there is fantastic, absolutely fantastic. You can move girls anywhere, you know. All they do is they're so pleased to be working and happy for working. And we've got a very good technical staff. And as I started the whole thing, they very kindly used me as a consultant, which just allows me to go up there twice a month. And I stay overnight and go out with the boys overnight. And they give me all jobs to develop and so on and so forth. Keeps me happy. I don't make any money, but I'm not worried about that. It keeps you out of mischief.
And this is a medium which Sir Edward Lewis apparently had no faith in at all.
No, he didn't like anything new. That's why he really took him a long time. It was only the war that forced him to take into Decca Navigator, and he told me one day, he said, I don't trust any engineers. Because he said, they always tell me it's going to cost, 500,000, and then it costs $1.5 million. Of course, he was absolutely right. He's absolutely right. No, he is a marvellous man to work for.
You were with digital from the start, weren't you? You were very
yes,
proud.
oh yes, absolutely.
Even when the first tests were
started. Yes. I mean, from the day I first heard it at Kingswood Warren, because one thing, you see, there is no tape modulation noise. You know, if you run tape, even if you run it at really fast, and you put sine wave on, when you can see this band at the top and bottom, which is the tape modulation. You don't get any of that with. It's absolutely clean. The signal to noise ratio can go right down to 90 dB. In fact, it's frightening. It's too dead, and I think that's what frightened people at first.
Do you think this is what leads people into being deceived about reverberation? People say the reverberation dies more quickly in digital recordings. Do you think really what they're hearing is the silence behind the noise?
I think they're right, but I don't know why. I had some very rigid tests done on this just before I retired, and we recorded at a very high speed for the ordinary tape, and so the quality on it was almost indistinguishable. But it's this thing you were talking about. There is something there, and you can't define it. But there is something. Though we went to a lot of tests on this question about reverberation times, and I don't know what that is, because Onsame had many theories on this, because if you've got two takes and the intensity of the sound is slightly different, so the reverberation time is different. You can't join on the reverberation time now. You can hear it. Some people said they could hear it, others didn't. We did these tests in Kingsway Hall, but whether it's the atmosphere that's behind an orchestra, the ambient sound in the room, if you take this away, for instance, if you run just running a tape through a machine, and suddenly you open up your mixers, you immediately get the rush of noise from the room, the ambient noise of the room. And if you take that ambient noise away, the sound doesn't seem natural. It becomes too clinical. Because with digital you can get 90 dB of signal to noise ratio. There isn't any noise. I mean, that's provided there's no noise from the studio. But I mean, even this noise of, you don't hear it now, but of a violin moving, the chap's shoulders and his coat, and you get 60 people doing that. It's this ambient noise that's behind it. And at the end of a big chord, the reverberation does seem to hang on. It seems to last that little bit longer.
On what? On analog?
On analog
yes.
tape. But I wouldn't like to. I wouldn't like to say too much about this, because we've done a lot of tests, and on the whole, of course, you must use digital because of this fact of copying tapes. Even if it was slightly inferior, because when you're in a big company, you have a master tape. EMI never worked from their master tapes. That goes in the archives, and they work from a copy. Well, then they want to send a copy to someone in Belgium or France. That's the second generation. And then they want to make a cassette, so they make a running master. That's the fourth generation. And this is disastrous. But if you do it on digital, and we have tapes, we have a tremendous number of tapes coming up to us from the pop studios, where they're recorded on digital, so that we've really got the cassette is really the first generation of the master tape, and that's one of the reasons it's such a step forward.
Interesting thought.
The only thing is they cheat. They record on 16 track and then mix it down and then send you a digital copy of the mix down, which you can't fool old people.
Not strictly related, but another question arises in my mind. What has been Decca's policy down the years? They cut from masters, but artistically, how long do they keep off cuts? Do you know, is that more producers' territory than engineers?
Oh, they keep
musical corrections 10 years hence on.
Oh no, not as long as that. They keep them until the master has been, the record has been issued, and it's been reviewed, possibly a year after it's been reviewed, and then the take ones and take twos and take threes, that's what we call them, then they're scrapped.
It seems to me that the progress since the LP in the days of Decca has been a story of distinction compared with certain other people who have followed the same track. For instance, you eschewed quadrophony. It never appeared on Decca. Do you think that? Well, what do you attribute this success story to over 3 decades, 4 decades?
Well, I think without a shadow of a doubt, it's due to the whole of the staff. I can only talk about the technical staff working in the studios, and their willingness to discuss with each other, and even when they've been out on sessions, when the tapes come, when the records have finally come through, they couldn't wait to get in the listening room and really listen to them, and really blow their top if they thought something had happened in the transfer. And also the good relations that we had, and we still have, with the artist department. We don't interfere with them, and they certainly don't interfere with us. When you get this sort of team working, although a lot of the artist department now have quite a fair knowledge of electronics, and some of the engineers have got jolly good musical knowledge, but if a chap is an engineer, he's basically an engineer. And I don't want him standing up in a playback and saying he thinks the conductor's taking it too fast, because that has happened. It's disastrous. And the other thing that I always insisted was, when we went away as a crew, you probably have 4 engineers and 2 musical pods. Although they might be staying in a different hotel because they've got to meet artists there, we always arranged that in the evening after sessions, we always had our midday meal, our evening meal all together, and the day's work, was openly discussed, around the meal table. And these things are this openness is so important. I can remember doing the Stuttgart Chamber Orchestra, and they were a marvellous little orchestra, and we were working in Geneva, and we'd been working all day, and it didn't sound right. This is your previous question. It didn't sound right, and you could do what you like, change mics, put mics up, put them down, and about 4:30 in the afternoon, Olaf's sitting there with a score on his lap, and he suddenly stands up. He says, "I know what's wrong. They can't play the bloody thing." That was Olaf, but it would break the tension, you see, because it comes to a point, and of course this change of temperature is so, and humidity. I remember doing some backhouse sessions, and he came in the morning in the Victoria Hall, and he said it was too cold, he couldn't play, so he made perhaps a couple of hours of work, and he came back in the evening, and of course the caretaker said, "I'll make it hot," and by God he did. Of course we worked in the evening, and when we wanted to join the stuff, we couldn't join it. All these things are so terribly important. Humidity. And of course the acoustics of the hall that you work in. This is the be all and end all.
Which, at risk of sounding invidious, or risk of tempting you to invidious comparisons, which is the favourite hall you've ever recorded in?
Victoria, Kingsway Hall. It has one great snag, there's an underground train there. And we've got a big filter in there now that cuts this rumble out. But it does break through a little bit and disturbs people. See, EMI recorded there before the war, Kingsway Hall. We took it over from them after the war, when they had Abbey Road and they didn't like poor old Kingsway Hall anymore, and they could have bitten their fingers off afterwards. I don't like the halls in Vienna. I refuse.
You don't like the Sophian cell?
Oh yes, no, that's the best. That's the best we've found. We originally recorded in this one that belongs to the Vienna Philharmonic. What the hell is it called?
Not the Musikverein.
Yes, the Musikverein cell. And they produce acoustic charts to show how bloody marvellous it is. And but when you get 4,000 people in there, it's quite good. But when it's empty for a session, you've got 6 seconds. Up and down, it's hopeless. And I refused point blank to record there. And I went out and found this Sophian cell. And the Vienna Philharmonic immediately wrote a round robin, and did a round robin and sent it off to Rosengarten to say they weren't going to record for Decca anymore. But when they heard the results of the sessions, they wanted to give concerts there. They're terribly funny musical artists. They really are funny people.
What about the Concertgebouw, which Decca recorded in a lot of the early 50s?
Very good.
Yes.
I did
and are again now.
Yes. We were the first people in the Concertgebouw to take all the chairs out and put the orchestra in the middle of the floor. If you record in the Concertgebouw with the orchestra on the podium, the reverberation time down and back is too long. But if you put them in the centre of the hall, you cut that approximately by half, and then the acoustics are marvellous. We made some, with Van Bynum, we did a lot of work there with Van Bynum.
You recorded Bruckner 7 with him, didn't you, at the time? Wasn't that at the time when you were making waxes along with tape?
Well, we would have made acetate discs along with tape. Yes, probably. Yes.
That was around 47.
Yes.
That still sounds marvellous, doesn't it?
Yes. We did a lot of Benjamin Britten's works in there as well. Oh, that type of that isn't work. That's a pleasure. That's all the work. You enjoy every minute of it, especially if you've got the right people round you. And this is why that original National Symphony Orchestra, was so marvellous. Dennis Brain and all these people.
Who led it?
Pardon?
Who led it?
Sidney Beer.
He was the leader.
Yes, Sidney Beer. And he was the one who, I've forgotten the first violin, I think it was McCullum, and he stood up and he said, "Mr. Beer, if you don't stop talking, we shall play tonight. We shall play tonight like you can dance." And they meant it too. Boy, some marvellous players there. But of course, Sidney Beer was a very rich man, and he was from the diamond firm, you see. and he paid for all the things to keep. He spent about $500,000 on that orchestra. A very lovable chap. He lived in Switzerland, and a very likeable chap. But he was hopeless as a conductor. And George Solti,
That's right. Yes.
Solti was only a small conductor in third-rate opera houses in I don't know where's the other side of the Iron Curtain, I think. And I made his very first sessions in Zurich, in this concert hall in Zurich, which is terrible. And he got so bloody excited, old George, he spread his shirt right the way across the back. And on the same session, same lot of recording, he was booked as the accompanist to George Kuhlenkamp, the German violinist, a very fine violinist. And as we had a day over, Rosengarten let him do this conducting of the Tom Hill Orchestra. And Rosengarten made him. That's why Solti annoys me very much when I've heard him giving interviews on the television about this little man in Zurich. Of course, everything he's got he owes to Rosengarten. Everything. I know he's a great showman, Solti. He's like that chap I was trying to tell you about, this other conductor in Vienna who walks in the opera house, As he walks in the morning, he takes the glove off and throws it to one man and the glove to the other one off.
So, to ask you a question you must have been asked many times before, actually. If you could alter any part of your professional life, would you, looking back on it? Or would you do it all the same again?
Oh no, I made mistakes, I'm sure, but I'd do it all again, but I think I'd make a better job of it than I did. If I believed in something, I never let go.